Hey guys, so let's take a look at where I got to with our volume sim. In the last video we we're just trying to set up a basic volume sim to drive our particle advection, and I've done a flipbook of where it is now. Pretty much the same actually. I found that knocking down the dissipation rate really revealed a bunch of expanding volume that was being chopped off before. So that's worked out quite well, I think, because now this really extends into the scene quite a lot. So we shouldn't have a problem filling up that internal section over here with particles. So something like this should do nicely, and it's not overly detailed, so it shouldn't end up in a mess. If I come back over here, nothing changed in the sourcing. I think this is still at 1000 for the divergence, and I've got still low disturbance, normal value for turbulence, and then quite a low dissipation value there. And I think I've still got the simulation at 2 times speed. And so that's what I'm left with here. But the actual density is actually pretty low. If we look at this, that's kind of low, so I'm just boosting it up a little bit here with a volume ramp. So I think that's good for our base sim for us to move forward and do some particle stuff now. So let's take our sphere and just generate a particle source from that. So we want this, we'll scatter some points here. So let's go for quite a lot for now, but we will need to crank this right up. We need as many points as possible in this particle advection stage. Before I scatter, actually, let's put down a VOP and apply some noise to this. So I'm just going to put down a turbulent noise. We keep it 1D. I'll choose sparse. Let's get that in the color. So what I want to do first is basically just have a kind of high frequency but quite sharp selection here. So I'm trying to exaggerate at this point how separate and shapely the particle sim will be. So the more small pockets we can have, the more we're sure that there'll be tendrils of particles flying out from these small areas into the volume sim. So some basic noise there, and then here on the scatter, to make sure we're being the most efficient with our point count, I can base the density of the scatter on color. So now I'm getting loads of points there. And let's also just delete anything below 0.5. Just to cull some of that. We might need to make this smaller or bigger. We'll see when we start to advect. Right, so here I want my pop net. And in the second input, I'll put my volume sim. And before we check that out, let me just set my pops to 174 as well. And we set this to all points, first context. Let's put an age on there. Put down a pop advect by volumes, second input, and let's start with velocity and trace. So that looks kind of interesting already. Gonna see if we can look at this. Oh, what have I done? I think I've just broken something. There we go. Yeah, so something like that. I think it could be even more broken up. We don't want to completely hide the drone itself, so it needs to be pretty thin. So there are a few tricks we can use to get that as a result. To start with, I'm going to just take our source over here and just break it up a little bit more. So in this instance, we can have a little bit more visible volume. We scatter our points, we keep just the white ones, and then I'll put down another noise. And this can be the color that we're advecting as well. So we go much higher frequency. Okay, so the idea here is all of these points will be advected, but now that sim will be full of interesting areas of brighter points, darker points as well. So we can use that in our alpha or for our density if we rasterize this. So you're just looking for high potential of detail. So we have a noise to limit our advection points, and then we have a noise which is the color of our advected points. And we're getting that velocity from the point cloud. I'm just going to switch off initial velocity here. And then I wanted to try and use a different advection method. Update position should technically be the most accurate. So it's really maintaining the shapes of the volume itself, because those points are just being forced to a new position instead of the velocity of the volume being added to the velocity of the point, and then see what happens. So it should generally be a much more accurate representation of the underlying volume itself. But you can see we've still got a pretty full looking volume there of our point cloud. So a combination of tweaking how frequent our input noise is here, because that will give us very definite directions in our particles. A combination of that, and then just trying to rein in this advection. So one way you can force these particles to form a little bit more of a contained tendril is to actually take this volume and compute a gradient. So I think there's a, is it volume analysis? We just plug that in and we choose gradient. So I'll use the density and I'll compute the gradient of that density, which, as you know from before, should be basically the normal pointing outwards to the more dense areas of the volume. So it should give us a direction outwards based on the density. So that's giving us a new density here, density X, Y, and Z. So it's a vector. So I'll just put that into the third input. I'm going to duplicate this advection, and here I will take the third input. So what I'm doing now is advecting the particles by the volume's gradient, not by the velocity. So it's a little bit hard to see what's going on. See if I change the value, reset. Okay, well that did the trick. So it looks like it only needs a very small value, and you can always check your values with the pop network pretty quickly here if you just change something and keep the same frame and hit reset. If we try and take a look at what this is doing, so it's really tightening up, and in terms of this velocity scale, I guess it's maybe not even changing the scale of the effect of that normal pass. Except when I went really high, it seems to, I guess, over push the particles. So something small, and you point that to a gradient field, and you basically start to force the particles back inside themselves. So if you imagine this volume here, our standard pop advection is filling up this entire volume with particles. And then we're doing a second advection every step of the simulation, which is then taking those particles that are filling here and pushing them in the direction of the normal or the gradient. So these particles are being forced to update their position, and in the next step they're being pushed in the direction of the volume's gradient and then being forced to update their position again. So they're still moving along with the advection of the volume, but they're forced to kind of always maintain their position in the densest parts of that volume sim. So I hope that makes sense. And I've seen it before. You can do this if you, I don't know if you've seen, there's a cigarette smoke workflow that someone's done in a SOP solver, which is basically an advection using, I think it's a VDB advection. And same principle, you take that volume, you get the normal from it, and you force those points to become really thin and make these thin strands. And for an effect like this, that's very beneficial. Okay, and then there's an element to this as well that we can't really see here because of our black and white. But the second thing to tweak after the main noise is just how messy this secondary noise is. So I can go a bit more extreme here and just get small areas of white. And then what should happen is if we put down, say, an alpha based on the color there, we'll even exaggerate more that feeling like there's very small tendrils of particles. So let's do that now quickly. I'm going to just make sure we're only exporting the particles. Put down a wrangle here, and let's say alpha equals CDX. Okay, so now depending on the fall off we have on that initial noise, we should get variations in transparency here. So I'm just going to adjust some viewport settings, and then we can have a look at how this looks through the camera. Yeah, so we are getting a little bit of interesting tendrils here. So we're getting definite wisps of white particles with gaps in between. So a lot of that is based off of the source noise. And then obviously we're using that normal gradient from the initial volume to just force these particles to adhere to the densest part of that sim. Okay. The other thing we can do is maybe multiply this alpha again by, let's do a ramp. Let's do age. So we'll take the alpha, and the alpha is the same as the color, and then take it again and multiply that all by the age divided by life. And so now if we make a density and rasterize this, we'll get some natural linear. I don't like to play too much with the ramps of how something dissipates. For me, it should always feel like it starts dense and it varies very in a straight line, becomes less and less and less dense until it disappears. So I think that forms the basis of the particle advection, and another few areas here to mess around. Different advection methods, completely changing the sim's look once again with the noises on the source. And then we're just taking that all through here and generating an alpha. So I'm just going to save this. Our next step would be probably to try and rasterize, but before I do that, I'm going to boost our particle count here and at least just get a few frames if my computer can manage. A few frames there, and let's generate a density attribute and see how this looks through a rasterize. So here I'll just say density equals alpha. Let's put down a VDB. And put down a rasterize from particles. Okay. Just going to cancel that quick and just reduce our particle scale here quickly a bunch before we try it. There we're seeing something. I'm going to knock this down a little. Okay, there you can start to see our tendrils coming out of this rasterized volume. So here it's just a matter of tweaking the scale, and I could also base P scale on the alpha, but I think it's going to feel better if this volume is just fading off rather than kind of shrinking. Another thing to bear in mind, especially with rasterizing, is the viewport is only going to be able to display a certain amount of detail in this volume. So to try and come up with good settings, at least as a base before rendering, I do usually take a delete and have a little bit of a smaller area here. So if we compare the detail in the viewport, that's kind of what we're looking at when we look at all the points. But if we just shrink that point selection down, we're getting a higher resolution representation of that volume. So that's more in line with how it would look rendered compared to that. So I'm just going to have a look at another section here. So we're getting some nice shapes in there. I'm pretty happy with that. And we can boost up this resolution. And you can see our point count is, at this resolution, our point count is not enough out of the sim to kind of fill up all these gaps. But the question of how much resolution do we need, how dense should it be, that's more of once we're rendering this, to double check all that before we submit the full sequence. So you see how thin and wispy you can get this. And that's visualizing the whole thing, and like I said, if we just keep a portion of it, you get a little bit of a better representation of how that looks in the render. And I think that's looking pretty cool right there. Yeah, so something like that. Now this is all, that's all fine over there. What we do need to do now is add some variation and make sure that we get our 3 pulses. So we've got one volume sim and one pop sim at the moment. And what we can do is basically you'd put down, let me grab a ROP from somewhere quickly. You would put down a ROP. And then in the, if we click on this ROP over here, in the pre-render script, we can make each ROP do something else to the sim. And what I was trying to explain earlier is that just by changing this noise, you'll get a drastically different looking pop sim. Because in this one, here's points flying out in this direction and this direction, and if we offset that noise, we'll have points flying out in completely different directions in that sim. So let me put down a parameter here. Don't know what's happening to my typing. So we'll have a parameter and we can plug this into the offset. Over there. And just pay attention to when you hover your mouse over, the parameter's actual name is offset. So that could have been something else, but I've just named everything the same. So we need to know that to add our pre-render script here. So you just put up palm, and then you point it to the particular VOP or whatever it is you want to change the value. So in this case, I just want, what is it? Point VOP 1. And on that VOP, you put down a space, so / space, and then the name of the parameter you want to change. So if you were, say, changing something inside the popnet, you would say popnet1 / and then say pop advect by volumes, / space, and then the parameter on that object that you want to change. So let me just think, have I got that right? Well, we can test this. So if I put this offset to say 5, so here's where I'm setting my value. The current value of this offset is 0. So if I just change this to current frame, or even leave this and I say save to disk, and then I interrupt it, has my value changed to 5? Yes. So without me changing that, the ROP itself has changed that value to 5. So all we want to do here basically is we'll duplicate this 3 times or more, depending on how much you want to test it. And just in each one of these, you just choose a random value. Okay. And you could have 10 of these and just grab them all, hit render, and what you'll get back is 10 different sims with a different variation on that offset. So you should get 10 very different sims. So I'm going to do that, and I'll probably have maybe 5 or 6 of these, render them out, and then choose the best looking ones based on that frame. And we need to end up with 3, because the idea here is we're going to use a different sim for each one of our pulses over here. Then we can merge those all together and run them through our rasterizer over here, and then set this up for some render tests and do some rendering. So I'll catch you guys in the next video once I've selected my 3 favorite options, and we'll do some shading and test renders. So I'll see you then.